A bullet between love and betrayal. Alessandra Romano had always believed her name made her untouchable. But when her father's empire crumbled, she learned how quickly power could be taken. Dario Benedetti tilted his head, his smirk slow and dangerous. "Your father thought he could cheat me," he murmured. "Now, I own his most precious possession, you." Chapter 1. The Shattering of Glass Crowns. The chandelier, a monstrous constellation of Venetian glass, trembled above Alessandra Romano. Not from a physical tremor, but from the seismic shift in her world. The crystal teardrops, usually refracting light into 1,000 rainbows, seemed to weep, mirroring the slow, agonizing drip of her own composure. She sat rigidly in the plush velvet armchair, her hands, once adorned with family heirlooms, now clenched so tightly the knuckles gleamed white against the fading tan of a summer long gone. The scent of aged leather and her father's favorite Cuban cigars, a once comforting aroma, now choked her, thick with the acrid tang of fear. The expansive study, usually a sanctuary of hushed negotiations and weighty decisions, felt alien. The towering bookshelves, lined with first editions and legal tomes, blurred into an indistinct wall of mahogany. Her father, Don Antonio Romano, a man who had always commanded respect, fear, and a grudging admiration, was reduced to a pleading, broken figure. He stood before Dario Benedetti, the newly crowned Capo dei Capi, his posture a grotesque parody of supplication. Dario. The name itself felt like a shard of ice lodged in Alessandra's throat. He was younger than her father, perhaps by a decade, but the years had etched a hardness onto his face that belied his age. His eyes, the color of polished obsidian, held a glacial calm that was far more terrifying than any overt display of anger. He was a predator, sleek and lethal, and Alessandra felt the primal instinct to flee, to disappear into the shadows of the grand palazzo that had been her home, her fortress, for all of her 58 years. "Antonio," Dario's voice was a low rumble, a velvet-covered threat. "You disappoint me. I offered you a partnership, a chance to share in the spoils. You chose deception." Alessandra's father swallowed, the sound amplified in the suffocating silence. "Dario, I swear, it was a misunderstanding. A miscalculation." Dario's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a wolf baring its teeth, not in amusement, but in anticipation. "Miscalculations have consequences, Antonio. You know this." "We both do." He gestured with a languid hand, a subtle flick of the wrist that held more power than any shouted command. Two of his men, silent shadows in impeccably tailored suits, stepped forward. They were the kind of men who moved with a chilling grace, their presence radiating a quiet menace. They were the instruments of Dario's will, the extensions of his power. Alessandra watched, frozen, as they flanked her father. The air crackled with unspoken violence. She wanted to scream, to beg, to offer herself in his place, but the words were trapped in her throat, choked by the sudden, overwhelming realization of her own helplessness. She had always been protected, shielded from the brutal realities of her father's world. She had lived a life of privilege, of garden parties and opera nights, of carefully curated friendships and strategically advantageous marriages. The mafia, to her, had been a distant hum, a backdrop to her gilded existence. Now, it was a roaring inferno, consuming everything she had ever known. "What do you want?" Antonio's voice was a ragged whisper, stripped of its usual authority. Dario tilted his head, his gaze shifting, locking onto Alessandra. It was a slow, deliberate movement designed to maximize the impact. She felt her breath hitch, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken intent. "Your debt is considerable, Antonio," Dario said, his voice still deceptively soft. "Far beyond any monetary value." He paused, letting the silence stretch, taut and agonizing. "But I am a man of certain appetites." Alessandra felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She understood, with a sickening clarity, what he was implying. She had seen this before, in whispers and veiled conversations, in the carefully averted gazes of the women in her social circle. The daughters, the wives, the sisters sometimes, they were the currency used to settle debts, to forge alliances, to appease the powerful. She had always been above it, untouchable, the daughter of Don Antonio Romano. Now, she was just another pawn in a deadly game. He continued to look at her, and something in his gaze changed. It was no longer ice, but an appraising fire. The look of a man who knew how to get what he wanted, and keep it. Your daughter will do nicely. Her father's face went from pale to crimson, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and despair. No, he rasped, his voice cracking. Dario, I beg you anything but that. Dario raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture. You have no say in this, Antonio. You forfeited that right when you betrayed my trust. He turned his full attention back to Alessandra, his gaze unwavering. Alessandra. He spoke her name like a possession, a claim staked. You will come with me. It wasn't a request. It was a command. And in that moment, Alessandra Romano, the pampered socialite, the protected daughter, ceased to exist. She was replaced by a woman stripped bare, exposed to the harsh realities of a world she had only glimpsed from afar. A world where power was absolute and mercy was a weakness. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of terror and a nascent defiance. She wouldn't cower. She wouldn't beg. She would face this, whatever it entailed, with the dignity that was her birthright, even if that birthright was now stained with the blood of her father's failures. Very well, she said, her voice surprisingly steady, a testament to the steel that had always run through the Romano women, hidden beneath layers of silk and sophistication. I will go with you. But beneath the surface of acceptance, a single, desperate question echoed in the silent chambers of her heart. Could she survive this gilded cage, and the man who held the key? The unsettling feeling that she wanted to lingered. Chapter 2. Shadows of a Fallen Empire. The drive to Dario's estate was a blur of rain-slicked streets and blurred city lights. Alessandra sat stiffly in the back of the black Mercedes, the plush leather seats offering no comfort. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the low hum of the engine. She hadn't spoken since leaving her father's palazzo, her mind reeling from the abrupt and brutal upheaval of her life. She glanced at the man beside her, one of Dario's silent enforcers. He sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his face an impassive mask. He was a younger man, perhaps in his early 30s, but his eyes held the same unsettling coldness she had seen in Dario's. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, who had done things that would haunt the dreams of ordinary people. Alessandra looked away, focusing instead on the passing scenery. The familiar landmarks of her city, once symbols of comfort and security, now seemed alien and threatening. The elegant boutiques, the bustling cafes, the grand opera house, they belonged to a life that was no longer hers. She was entering a different world, a world of shadows and secrets, where the rules were different and the stakes were infinitely higher. She thought of her father, his broken figure standing before Dario. Shame and anger warred within her. Shame at his weakness, his inability to protect her. Anger at his betrayal, the one that brought her into the present moment. A betrayal that had cost him everything, including his only daughter. But beneath the shame and anger, there was a flicker of pity. She knew, deep down, that he had loved her, in his own flawed way. He had tried to shield her from the darkness, to keep her safe within the gilded cage of their privileged life. He had failed spectacularly, but his intentions, at least, had been born of love. The car turned off the main road, climbing a winding driveway that led to a sprawling estate perched high on a hill overlooking the city. The house, a magnificent villa built in the classical style, was bathed in a soft, golden light that spilled from the windows. It looked like a scene from a fairy tale, a place of beauty and tranquility. But Alessandra knew better. This was a fortress, a lair, the domain of a man who ruled through fear and intimidation. The car stopped before the imposing front entrance. The enforcer beside her opened the door, his movements precise and efficient. He offered her his hand, a silent gesture of courtesy that felt strangely incongruous given the circumstances. Alessandra hesitated for a moment, then took his hand, allowing him to help her from the car. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sea. The silence here was different from the silence in the car. It was a deeper, more profound silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind and the faint sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. Dario was waiting for her at the top of the stairs, a silhouette framed against the warm glow of the entrance hall. He was wearing a dark suit, the fabric tailored to perfection, emphasizing his lean, powerful physique. He looked every inch the capo, the master of this domain, a man who commanded respect and obedience. As she approached, he descended the stairs, his movements fluid and graceful. He stopped before her, his obsidian eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Welcome, Alessandra," he said, his voice a low murmur, "to your new home." The words were polite, almost gentle, but there was an underlying current of possessiveness, a clear assertion of his ownership. He was reminding her, subtly but unmistakably, that she was his now, a prize to be claimed, a possession to be displayed. She met his gaze, her chin lifted in a gesture of defiance. "I am not a possession, Dario." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "No? Perhaps not in the traditional sense. But you are here under my protection, under my authority. That makes you mine, in a way that transcends mere ownership." "Protection?" Alessandra echoed, her voice laced with skepticism. "Or imprisonment?" He smiled, a slow, predatory smile. "The lines can be blurred, Alessandra, especially in our world." He offered her his arm, a gesture of courtly elegance.
"Come?"
"I will show you to your rooms." She hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to run, to escape this gilded cage before it was too late. But she knew there was nowhere to run. Her father was powerless, her family's empire shattered. She was alone, trapped in a world she didn't understand, at the mercy of a man who was both terrifying and strangely compelling. She took his arm, the feel of his warm, solid presence sending a shiver through her. It was a strange sensation, a mixture of fear and something else. Something she couldn't quite define, something that both intrigued and disturbed her. They walked together into the villa, the heavy oak doors closing behind them with a resounding thud, sealing her fate. The entrance hall was vast and opulent, with marble floors, soaring ceilings, and walls adorned with priceless artwork. It was a display of wealth and power, designed to impress and intimidate. As they walked through the silent halls, Alessandra felt a growing sense of unease. The house was beautiful, but it was also cold and impersonal, lacking the warmth and familiarity of her family's palazzo. It felt like a museum, a showcase for a life that was not her own. Dario led her to a suite of rooms on the second floor, overlooking the gardens and the sea. The rooms were lavishly decorated, with silk drapes, antique furniture, and a four-poster bed draped in luxurious fabrics. It was a room fit for a queen, or perhaps a prized concubine. "These are your rooms," Dario said, his voice echoing in the spacious chamber. "You will find everything you need here. If there is anything else you desire, you need only ask." Alessandra looked around, her gaze lingering on the heavy drapes that blocked out the night. "Freedom," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That is what I desire." Dario turned to her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Freedom is a relative term, Alessandra. We are all prisoners of our own desires, our own obligations. You are no different." He stepped closer, his presence filling the room, overwhelming her senses. She could smell his cologne, a subtle blend of citrus and spice, a scent that was both alluring and dangerous. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. It was a gentle touch, almost tender, but it sent a shiver of apprehension through her. "You will learn to adapt, Alessandra," he said, his voice a low, seductive whisper. "You will learn to appreciate the benefits of your new life." His words were a promise and a threat. A promise of luxury, of protection, of a life beyond her wildest dreams. A threat of consequences, of pain, of a fate worse than death if she dared to defy him. And as she looked into his dark, enigmatic eyes, she knew that her life, as she had known it, was over. She was now the capo's plaything, a pawn in his game, a prisoner in his gilded cage. But somewhere, deep within her, a spark of defiance still flickered. She would not be broken. She would survive. She would find a way to reclaim her life, even if it meant playing his game for now. She just hoped she would not lose herself in the process. Chapter 3. Debts Written in Blood and Tears. The first few days in Dario's villa were a strange mixture of suffocating luxury and quiet terror. Alessandra was treated with a deference that bordered on reverence. Servants, their faces carefully neutral, anticipated her every need. Meals, exquisite creations prepared by a renowned chef, were served on fine china in a private dining room. Her wardrobe, once filled with elegant but understated attire, was replenished with designer gowns, shimmering silks, and glittering jewels. It was a life of unimaginable opulence, yet it felt utterly hollow. She spent most of her time alone, wandering through the vast, silent rooms, or gazing out at the sea from her balcony. The view was breathtaking, the endless expanse of azure water stretching to the horizon, but it offered no solace. She felt like a caged bird, surrounded by beauty, but unable to fly. She had seen little of Dario. He was a phantom presence, a shadow that flitted through the periphery of her existence. She would hear his voice, low and commanding, issuing orders to his men. She would catch glimpses of him, striding through the halls, his face set in that familiar mask of cold detachment. He treated her with a chilling courtesy, a formal politeness that only served to emphasize the vast gulf between them. One evening, a week after her arrival, she was summoned to his study. She found him standing by the window, gazing out at the city lights that twinkled like fallen stars. He turned as she entered, his eyes assessing her with that unsettling intensity. "Alessandra," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Join me." She approached him cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The study was similar to her father's, but even more opulent, with walls lined with leather-bound books and antique maps. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "You sent for me," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands.
"I did."
He gestured to a chair opposite his desk.
"Seat."
She sat, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He remained standing, his presence dominating the room. "I've been observing you, Alessandra," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You are adapting well."
"Adapting?"
She echoed, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "I am a prisoner, Dario. I am not adapting. I am enduring." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. Endurance is a valuable quality, especially in our world. He paused, his gaze sharpening. "But endurance is not enough. I require more." Alessandra felt a chill creep up her spine. "More? What more could you possibly want?" He moved towards her, his movements fluid and graceful, like a predator stalking its prey. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Your father owed me a great deal, Alessandra," he said, his voice a low, seductive whisper. "Not just money. He owed me respect, loyalty. He betrayed those things. And you believe I should pay for his sins?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheekbone. It was a gentle touch, but it sent a shiver through her. "You are his daughter. His blood runs in your veins. You are a part of him." "I am not my father," she said, her voice firm. "I am my own person." He smiled, a slow, predatory smile. "Perhaps. But you are also a Romano, and the Romanos have a debt to pay." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. "A debt that will be paid in blood and tears." Alessandra felt a surge of fear, but also a spark of defiance. She would not be intimidated. She would not let him break her. "What do you want from me, Dario?" she asked, her voice steady. He straightened, his gaze locking with hers. I want your cooperation, Alessandra. I want your loyalty. I want you to become a part of my world. And if I refuse? His smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard mask. Refusal is not an option. You are mine, Alessandra. You will do as I say. He turned away from her, walking back to the window. I have plans for you, Alessandra. Plans that will require your full participation. Alessandra felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She didn't know what those plans were, but she knew they would be dangerous and potentially deadly. She was caught in a web of deceit and betrayal, surrounded by enemies she couldn't identify. She was alone, vulnerable, and utterly at the mercy of a man who was both terrifying and strangely alluring. I will give you some time to consider, he said, without turning around. But do not mistake my patience for weakness. I always get what I want, Alessandra. Always. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, and she left the study, her mind racing. She knew she had to find a way to survive, to escape this gilded cage. But how could she fight a man who held all the cards, who controlled every aspect of her life? She needed an ally, someone she could trust. But in this world of shadows and secrets, trust was a luxury she could not afford. As she walked back to her room, a thought began to form in her mind, a dangerous, desperate plan. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance she had. And she was willing to risk everything to take it. She had to find out more about Dario, about his past, his weaknesses, his enemies. She had to find a way to turn the tables on him before he destroyed her completely. Chapter 4. The Cage of Gilded Promises. Alessandra began her subtle investigation with the servants. They were, after all, the invisible eyes and ears of the household. She started with Maria, the elderly housekeeper who oversaw the running of the villa. Maria was a woman of few words, her face etched with the lines of a hard life, but her eyes, though weary, held a flicker of kindness. Alessandra approached her one morning in the kitchen, where Maria was supervising the preparation of breakfast. The room was a symphony of clanging pots, sizzling pans, and the fragrant aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baking bread. Maria, Alessandra said, her voice soft and tentative. May I speak with you for a moment? Maria looked up from her task, her gaze assessing. Signorina, she said, her voice raspy with age. What is it you need? I am curious about this house, Alessandra said, choosing her words carefully. About Signor Benedetti. Maria's expression remained unchanged, but Alessandra noticed a slight tightening of her lips. The Signor is a good man, she said, her voice carefully neutral. He is generous and just. Alessandra knew that Maria was speaking out of loyalty, or perhaps fear. She wouldn't get any real information from her, not directly. She had to be more subtle. He seems lonely, Alessandra said, watching Maria's reaction closely. Does he have any family? Maria hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. The senior lost his family many years ago. A tragedy. She didn't elaborate, and Alessandra didn't press her. Over the next few days, Alessandra continued her quiet inquiries, gleaning snippets of information from the other servants. She learned that Dario had inherited his position as capo from his father, who had been killed in a bloody feud with a rival family. She learned that he was a ruthless businessman, but also a man of his word, fiercely loyal to those who earned his trust. She learned that he had a reputation for being demanding, both in business and in his personal life. The more she learned, the more complex Dario became. He was not simply a monster, a one-dimensional villain. He was a man shaped by violence and loss, a man who had built an empire on a foundation of fear and respect. And he was undeniably attractive. She found herself increasingly drawn to him, despite her fear, despite her better judgment. She would often find herself watching him, observing his movements, his expressions, the way he interacted with his men. She noticed the way his eyes would soften when he spoke of his late father, the way his jaw would tighten when he received news of a betrayal. She saw glimpses of vulnerability beneath the cold, hard exterior, hints of a man who yearned for something more than power and control. One afternoon, she found him in the gardens, tending to a rose bush. It was a surprising sight, this powerful, dangerous man, carefully pruning the delicate blooms. She approached him cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the soft grass. "They are beautiful," she said, gesturing to the roses. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of surprise in his gaze, followed by a hint of something else. Something that looked almost like warmth. "My mother loved roses," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it.
She planted this garden.
Alessandra was surprised by this glimpse into his past, this unexpected vulnerability. "It is a lovely tribute," she said, her voice sincere. He turned back to the roses, his fingers gently caressing a velvety petal. "She was a gentle soul," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "She did not belong in this world." Alessandra felt a pang of sympathy for him. She understood, perhaps better than he realized, what it was like to feel out of place, to be trapped in a world that was not of your choosing. "And you?" she asked, her voice soft. "Do you belong in this world, Dario?" He looked up at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I was born into it," he said, his voice flat. "There is no other world for me." He stood, his height towering over her. She could smell the scent of roses and his cologne, a heady mixture that made her heart race. "But there is another world for you." She had no idea why she said these words. He closed the distance between them, and without thinking she tilted her head, giving him access. His breath was hot on her neck. "And where would that be, Kara?" he said. "I have you right where I want you."
Do you?
She said it in a whisper. She was playing a dangerous game. She would either find her freedom, or something else entirely. He stepped away, as if the thought was too much. "Do not think that my sentimentality will make me any easier to get free." "You agreed. And I will always collect." Alessandra wanted to say more, but she didn't. She knew she was getting closer. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Life Once Lived. Alessandra continued her exploration of the villa, drawn to the older, less used sections of the house. These were the rooms that whispered of the past, that held the echoes of lives lived before Dario's reign. She discovered a dusty library filled with ancient tomes and forgotten manuscripts. She found a music room with a grand piano covered in a thick layer of dust, its keys yellowed with age. She stumbled upon a ballroom, its once gleaming parquet floor now dull and scuffed, the air thick with the ghosts of long-ago dances. In these forgotten corners of the house, Alessandra felt a connection to the past, a sense of continuity that transcended the present turmoil. She imagined the women who had lived here before her, the wives and daughters of previous capos, their lives shaped by the same forces that were now shaping hers. She wondered about their hopes and dreams, their fears and sorrows. She wondered if they, too, had felt like prisoners in this gilded cage. One day, she discovered a small, locked room at the end of a long corridor. Curiosity piqued, she asked Maria about it. That was Signora Benedetti's room, Maria said, her voice hushed. The signor's mother.
It has been locked since she passed.
Alessandra felt a surge of interest. Dario's mother, the woman who had loved roses, the gentle soul who did not belong in this world. She had to see inside that room. She waited until nightfall, when the house was quiet and the servants were asleep. She crept through the silent halls, her heart pounding in her chest, a hairpin clutched tightly in her hand. She had learned a few tricks from watching old movies, and she hoped they would work in real life. The lock was old and rusty, but surprisingly easy to pick. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air inside was stale and musty, thick with the scent of dried flowers and old perfume. The room was a time capsule, a perfectly preserved glimpse into the past. A four-poster bed, draped in faded silk, dominated the space. A dressing table, cluttered with antique brushes, combs, and perfume bottles, stood against one wall. A small writing desk, covered in a delicate floral pattern, sat by the window. Alessandra moved through the room, her fingers tracing the dusty surfaces. She felt a strange sense of intimacy, as if she were trespassing on a sacred space. She opened the drawers of the dressing table, finding delicate lace gloves, embroidered handkerchiefs, and a small, silver-framed photograph of a beautiful woman with sad eyes. Dario's mother. She sat at the writing desk, opening the top drawer. Inside, she found a stack of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were written in a delicate, flowing script, in Italian. Alessandra hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt. These were private letters, not meant for her eyes. But her curiosity, her desperate need to understand Dario, to find a way to connect with him, overcame her hesitation. She carefully untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters were written by Dario's mother to a friend, a confidant. They chronicled her life in the villa, her arranged marriage to Dario's father, a man she did not love, a man who was cold and distant. She wrote of her loneliness, her isolation, her longing for a different life. She wrote of her love for her son, her only source of joy in a world of darkness. As Alessandra read, she felt a growing sense of empathy for this woman, this kindred spirit who had lived and suffered in this same house decades before. She understood her loneliness, her isolation, her yearning for something more. She found one letter, dated just a few months before Dario's mother's death, that was particularly poignant. "My dearest Isabella," it read, "I fear I am losing my way. The darkness is closing in, and I see no escape. I long for the light, for a life of peace and happiness, but I fear it is beyond my reach. My only hope lies in my son, in Dario. He is strong, and he has a good heart, despite the world he has been born into. I pray that he will find a way to break free from the shadows, to find the love and happiness that I have been denied." Alessandra carefully refolded the letter, her hands trembling. She felt a profound sadness for Dario's mother and a new understanding of Dario himself. He was not simply a ruthless capo, a product of his environment. He was a son who had lost his mother, a son who had been burdened with her hopes and dreams, her yearning for a better life. She replaced the letters in the drawer, closing it gently. She felt a sense of responsibility, a need to honor the memory of this woman, to help Dario find the light that his mother had longed for him to find. She left the room, locking the door behind her, the hairpin tucked safely away. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, delving into Dario's past, uncovering his secrets. But she also knew that it was the only way to understand him, to find a way to reach him, to perhaps even save him from himself. As she walked back to her room, the image of the woman in the photograph, Dario's mother, stayed with her. The plea in her eyes. Alessandra knew this was a turning point. She might actually have a chance to change things. Or, at least, she hoped she did. The doubt began to creep in. She needed to keep moving forward. Chapter 6. The Serpent's Gaze, a Flicker of Warmth. Alessandra's discovery of his mother's letters changed something within her. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the mask. She saw him not just as a captor, but as a complex, wounded individual, shaped by a past he could not escape. This new understanding, however, didn't diminish the danger. If anything, it heightened it. She was walking a tightrope, balancing her fear with a burgeoning empathy, her desire for freedom with a growing and unsettling attraction. She began to observe Dario more closely, looking for cracks in his armor, moments when the carefully constructed facade slipped. She noticed the way he would unconsciously touch the antique silver locket he always wore, a locket she suspected contained a picture of his mother. She saw the fleeting sadness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. She noticed the way he treated his loyal men, not as servants, but as trusted companions, sharing a joke, a word of encouragement, a rare smile. One evening, she found him in the library, standing before the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand. He was staring into the flames, his face lost in thought.
"Dario," she said, her voice soft.
He turned, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of surprise in his gaze, but also a hint of something else. Something that looked almost like welcome. "Alessandra," he said, his voice a low rumble. I did not hear you come in. I was exploring, she said, gesturing vaguely around the room. This is a beautiful library. He nodded, his gaze returning to the fire.
My father built it.
He was a scholar of sorts, in his own way. Alessandra moved closer, drawn to the warmth of the fire and to the unexpected vulnerability in his voice. Did you spend much time here with him? He hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. He was a busy man, and I was not always interested in books. But you are now, she said, her gaze sweeping over the shelves filled with leather-bound volumes. He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile. I have learned to appreciate them. They offer an escape.
Of sorts.
Alessandra understood. She, too, had sought refuge in books, in the worlds they created, the lives they depicted. What are you reading? She asked, gesturing to a book lying open on a nearby table. He picked it up, showing her the cover. It was a volume of Italian poetry, the words printed in a delicate, flowing script. Dante, he said. The Divine Comedy. Alessandra was surprised. She had not expected him to be a reader of poetry, especially something as profound and complex as Dante. It is a beautiful poem, she said, her voice sincere, but also a challenging one. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. Life is challenging, Alessandra. We all face our own infernos. She felt a pang of empathy for him. She knew he was referring to his own life, to the violence and darkness that surrounded him. And do you believe in redemption? She asked, her voice hesitant. In the possibility of paradise? He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then he slowly shook his head. I believe in consequences, he said, his voice flat. In the choices we make and the price we pay. He turned away from her, walking back to the fireplace. But perhaps, he added, his voice barely a whisper, perhaps there is a glimmer of hope, even in the darkest of nights. He didn't elaborate, and Alessandra didn't press him. She knew he was speaking not just of Dante's poem, but of his own life, his own struggles. He raised his glass, taking a sip of his drink. The firelight flickered on his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the strong line of his jaw. He looked vulnerable, almost human. Alessandra felt a strange stirring within her, a mixture of compassion and something else. Something she didn't dare to name, something that both terrified and intrigued her. She stepped a little closer, and without thinking raised a hand to the silver locket around his neck. Is this? He caught her hand in his, stopping the motion. His fingers were strong, but warm. She felt the shock of his touch to her very core. Yes, he said. His voice was rough, his eyes on her. My mother. He didn't release her hand. He held it and turned his focus completely on her. She felt a surge of something she couldn't define. I know about her, Dario, she said. His whole body went completely still. What do you know? His words were careful, calculated, but she could sense a hint of something underneath. Fear? Or something else entirely. She was playing with fire, but the warmth was so alluring. And she was so cold. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Obsidian Night. Dario's grip on Alessandra's hand tightened, not painfully, but possessively. The air in the library, already thick with the scent of old books and burning wood, crackled with a sudden, intense energy. The fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, casting dancing shadows on their faces, illuminating the raw emotion that simmered between them. What do you know? He repeated, his voice a low, almost dangerous whisper. His obsidian eyes, usually so carefully guarded, searched hers, seeking the truth, gauging the threat. Alessandra met his gaze, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew she was treading on sacred ground, venturing into a territory that was both forbidden and profoundly personal. But she couldn't turn back now. She had glimpsed the man beneath the mask, and she was determined to understand him, to reach him, even if it meant risking everything. I know she was unhappy, Alessandra said, her voice soft but firm, that she felt trapped, that she longed for a different life. Dario's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of pain in his eyes, a fleeting shadow of the grief he had carried for so long. He released her hand, but the connection between them remained, a taut, invisible thread that hummed with unspoken emotion.
How?
He asked, his voice rough. How did you know? Alessandra hesitated, then decided to tell him the truth.
I found her letters, she said.
In the locked room. The one that was hers. His eyes widened slightly, a mixture of surprise and something else. Anger? Betrayal? She couldn't quite decipher it. He turned away from her, walking towards the fireplace, his back to her. You had no right, he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. I know, Alessandra said, her voice apologetic. But I needed to understand. To understand you. He remained silent for a long moment, his shoulders tense, his hands clenched into fists. Alessandra waited, her breath caught in her throat, unsure of what he would do, what he would say. Finally, he turned back to her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. She was everything to me, he said, his voice raw with pain. My light. My guide.
And she was taken from me.
Too soon.
Too cruelly.
Alessandra felt a surge of empathy for him. She knew what it was like to lose someone you loved, to feel the gaping hole in your life that could never be filled. I am sorry, Dario, she said, her voice sincere. I truly am. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of her words. Then he slowly nodded. She loved you very much, Alessandra continued, her voice soft. She wanted you to be happy, to find peace. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the pain was too much to bear. Then he opened them again, his gaze locking with hers. And you? He asked, his voice low and intense. What do you want, Alessandra? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was a question that went far beyond her desire for freedom, her need to escape his control. It was a question that touched on the deeper, more complex emotions that were stirring within her, the feelings she had been trying so desperately to deny. She hesitated, her mind racing. She could lie, she could dissemble, she could play the game she had been playing since she arrived at the villa. But something in his eyes, a vulnerability, a plea for honesty, stopped her. I don't know, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I want to understand. To help. If I can. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, he took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. Help, he echoed, his voice a low murmur. How can you possibly help me, Alessandra? You are my prisoner. My plaything. I am more than that, Dario, she said, her voice firm.
And you know it.
He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. It was a gentle touch, almost tender, but it sent a shiver through her. Perhaps, he said, his voice a husky whisper. Perhaps you are. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. She could smell his cologne, the familiar scent of citrus and spice, mixed with the smoky aroma of the fire. She felt a pull towards him, a magnetic force that was both terrifying and irresistible. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a question, a plea. Alessandra closed her eyes, her senses reeling. She felt a surge of desire, a longing that surprised her with its intensity. He felt her unspoken consent and deepened the kiss. His hands moved to frame her waist. He pulled her close until their bodies were pressed together. She could have pulled away. A few short weeks ago, she would have.
But not now.
Not any longer. Just as she felt herself giving in, completely and utterly, the sound of a door closing somewhere in the villa broke the spell. Dario pulled back and moved. He turned to the door, waiting. Alessandra's breath hitched, her heart hammering. The spell had broken.
For now.
Chapter 8. Scars that time cannot erase. The sound of the closing door, though distant, shattered the fragile intimacy that had enveloped Alessandra and Dario. He straightened, his body instantly alert, the tenderness that had flickered in his eyes replaced by a cold, hard mask. The capo was back, the vulnerable man submerged beneath layers of carefully constructed control. Alessandra felt a pang of disappointment, a sense of loss that surprised her with its intensity. She had been on the verge of something profound, something transformative. And now, it was gone, snatched away by the harsh realities of their world. A moment later, one of Dario's men, Marco, appeared at the library door. He was a young man, but his face held the same unsettling stillness that Alessandra had come to associate with Dario's inner circle. "Senior," Marco said, his voice respectful but firm. "There is a situation. Your presence is required." Dario nodded, his expression unreadable. "Very well. I will be there shortly." Marco hesitated, his gaze flickering towards Alessandra. "And the signorina?" Dario glanced at Alessandra, his eyes dark and enigmatic. "She will remain here," he said, his voice flat. "She is safe." The word safe hung in the air, heavy with irony. Alessandra knew she was anything but safe. She was trapped in a dangerous game, caught between her desire for freedom and her growing and unsettling attraction to her captor. Marco bowed his head and left the room, leaving Alessandra and Dario alone once more. The silence stretched between them, taut and uncomfortable. The fire in the hearth had died down, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. "What was that about?" Alessandra asked, her voice breaking the silence. Dario turned to her, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "Business," he said, his voice curt. "Nothing that concerns you." Alessandra felt a surge of frustration. She was tired of being kept in the dark, of being treated like a child, a possession. She wanted to be included, to understand the world she was now a part of, even if it was a world of violence and darkness. "Everything that happens in this house concerns me, Dario," she said, her voice firm. "I am not a guest here. I am your prisoner.
I deserve to know what is going on."
He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he sighed, a hint of weariness in his voice. "There is a dispute," he said, choosing his words carefully, "with a rival family, over territory. It is complicated." Alessandra knew he was downplaying the situation, minimizing the danger. She had heard enough whispers, seen enough fleeting glances between the servants, to know that something serious was happening. "Is it dangerous?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "It can be," he said, his voice flat. "But I will handle it. I always do." He turned away from her, walking towards the door. "Stay here," he said, his voice commanding. "Do not leave this room until I return." Alessandra wanted to protest, to demand that he tell her more, but she knew it was useless. He was the capo, and she was whatever she was to him. She had no choice but to obey. He left the room, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Alessandra was alone, surrounded by the silent books, the flickering shadows, the lingering scent of his cologne. She felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She was worried about him, about what might happen. And she realized, with a jolt of surprise, that her concern went beyond mere self-preservation. She was starting to care about him, to care about his safety, his well-being. She walked over to the window, gazing out at the night. The city lights twinkled below, a vast, sprawling panorama of human life, of hopes and dreams, of love and loss. She wondered what Dario was doing, what dangers he was facing. She wondered if he would return. She thought of his mother's letters, of the gentle soul who had longed for a different life for her son. She wondered if Dario would ever find that life, if he would ever escape the shadows that had haunted him for so long. She reached out and touched the cold glass of the window, her fingers tracing the outline of a distant building. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to pray for his safety, to pray for his redemption. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer, a plea to whatever gods might be listening. She prayed for Dario, for herself, for a future she could barely imagine, a future where they could both be free from the darkness that surrounded them. She knew it was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all she had. And in that moment, surrounded by the silent whispers of the night, she clung to that hope with all her might, not knowing if the dawn would bring salvation or despair. She could only wait. Chapter 9. A dance on the razor's edge. The hours that followed were an agonizing eternity. Alessandra paced the library, her mind a whirlwind of anxieties and uncertainties. She tried to read, but the words blurred before her eyes, her concentration shattered by the constant fear that gnawed at her insides. She listened for any sound, any indication of Dario's return, but the house remained eerily silent. As the night wore on, her anxiety grew, fueled by her imagination. She pictured Dario facing his enemies, outnumbered, outgunned. She imagined him wounded, captured, or worse. The images were vivid, terrifying, and she couldn't shake them. She went to the window again, gazing out at the city below. The lights seemed to mock her, their cheerful twinkle a stark contrast to the darkness that had enveloped her heart. She felt utterly alone, isolated, cut off from the world. She thought of her former life, the carefree days of garden parties and opera nights, the carefully curated friendships and strategic alliances. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a distant dream that had vanished like smoke. She wondered if she would ever return to that life, if she would ever be free from the clutches of the mafia, from the grip of Dario Benedetti. The first rays of dawn began to paint the sky with hues of pink and gold, but the beauty of the sunrise offered no solace. Alessandra felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that something terrible had happened. Finally, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching the library. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. She turned towards the door, her breath caught in her throat. Dario entered the room, his face pale and drawn, his clothes disheveled. There was a dark stain on his shirt, a stain that looked suspiciously like blood. Alessandra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth.
Dario,
she cried, rushing towards him. What happened? Are you hurt? He waved her away, his expression grim. I am fine, he said, his voice hoarse. It is nothing. But Alessandra knew it was not nothing. She could see the pain in his eyes, the exhaustion etched on his face. She reached out to him, her fingers gently touching his arm. Let me see, she said, her voice soft but insistent. He hesitated, then slowly unbuttoned his shirt, revealing a long, shallow gash across his ribs. It was not a deep wound, but it was bleeding steadily. Alessandra felt a surge of relief, mixed with a wave of nausea. He was alive, he was not seriously injured. But the sight of his blood, the evidence of the violence he had endured, made her stomach churn. You need to clean this, she said, her voice trembling slightly. And bandage it. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. I have had worse, he said, his voice flat. I am sure you have, Alessandra said, her voice laced with sarcasm. But that does not mean you should ignore it. She led him to a nearby chair, pushing him gently down. She went to a small cabinet, where she knew there was a first aid kit. She found it, along with some clean cloths and a bottle of antiseptic. She returned to Dario, her hands surprisingly steady as she began to clean his wound. He winced, his muscles tensing, but he didn't protest. She worked quickly and efficiently, her touch gentle but firm. As she cleaned the wound, she noticed other marks on his body, old scars, reminders of past battles, past traumas. She wondered about the stories behind those scars, the pain he had endured, the violence he had witnessed. She finished cleaning the wound, applying a soothing ointment and a clean bandage. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There, she said, her voice soft. That should do it. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. It was a gentle touch, almost tender, and it sent a shiver through her. Thank you, Alessandra, he said, his voice a low murmur. You did not have to do that. I wanted to, she said, her voice sincere. He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile. You are surprising, Alessandra, he said. Full of contradictions.
And you're not,
she asked, her voice challenging. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that was surprisingly appealing. Perhaps we are more alike than we realize, he said. He stood up, his movements still a little stiff. He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense. The situation is resolved, he said, his voice returning to its usual flatness.
For now.
Alessandra nodded, understanding that the peace was fragile, that the threat of violence still lingered. He paused. I put myself at risk, worrying about you. I can't have that. It makes me weaker. And I you, she replied. He shook his head. No. It is different. I am the capo. I am always watched. The silence stretched, each of them aware of the perilous dance they were engaged in, a dance on the razor's edge of danger and desire. They needed to be careful, or someone would get hurt. Chapter 10. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. Despite the ever-present tension and the unspoken dangers that lurked in the shadows of their existence, a fragile, almost hesitant, normalcy began to settle between Alessandra and Dario. The shared intimacy of caring for his wound had subtly shifted their dynamic, creating a space for a cautious, almost tentative, connection. Dario, while still maintaining his distance and the carefully constructed persona of the ruthless capo, started to include Alessandra in small, seemingly insignificant ways. He would invite her to join him for meals, not in the formal dining room, but in a smaller, more intimate space overlooking the gardens. He would ask her opinion on matters unrelated to the business, seemingly valuing her perspective, her intelligence. Alessandra, in turn, continued her quiet observations, her subtle inquiries. She learned more about the intricacies of the mafia world, the complex web of alliances and rivalries, the codes of honor, and the brutal consequences of betrayal. She learned about Dario's responsibilities, the weight of the decisions he had to make, the constant pressure he was under. She also learned more about his past, piecing together fragments of information gleaned from conversations with Maria, from overheard whispers among the servants, from her own observations of Dario himself. She discovered that the situation that had resulted in his injury was more than just a territorial dispute. It was a direct challenge to his authority, a deliberate attempt to destabilize his power, orchestrated by a rival family, the Gallos, who had a long-standing vendetta against the Benedettis. One evening, while they were having dinner, Alessandra decided to broach the subject directly. Dario, she said, her voice hesitant, tell me about the Gallos. He looked up from his plate, his eyes narrowing slightly. Why do you ask? He said, his voice carefully neutral. I want to understand, she said. I want to know what you are facing. He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. The Gallos, he said, his voice laced with bitterness, are a persistent problem. They have been our enemies for generations. It is a blood feud. It goes back to my grandfather. What happened? Alessandra asked, her voice soft. He looked away, his gaze fixed on some distant point. It is a long story, he said. A story of betrayal, of murder, of revenge. He paused, his jaw tightening. My grandfather, Antonio Benedetti, was a powerful man, a respected man. He had built this empire from nothing. But he had enemies. The Gallos were one of them. They killed him? Alessandra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dario nodded. They ambushed him. Shot him in cold blood. My father, he was just a boy. He saw it all. Alessandra felt a pang of sympathy for him, for the young boy who had witnessed such a brutal act, for the man who had carried that burden of grief and anger for so long. And your father, he retaliated? She asked. Dario nodded again. He spent his life seeking revenge. He destroyed the Gallos, or so he thought. He killed their Don, their capo. He took everything they had. But they survived, Alessandra said. Some of them, Dario said. They went underground. They bided their time. And now they are back, seeking their own revenge. And they tried to kill you, Alessandra said, her voice trembling slightly. He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense. They will keep trying, he said, his voice flat. Until I am dead. Or they are. Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. She understood now the full extent of the danger he was in, the constant threat that hung over him. She also understood the weight of his responsibility, the burden of carrying on this bloody feud, this endless cycle of violence. Is there no other way? She asked, her voice hesitant. No way to end this? He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly shook his head. There is no other way, Alessandra, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. This is our world. This is our life. Blood demands blood. It is the code. But codes can be broken, Alessandra said, her voice firm. Traditions can be changed. He smiled a faint, sad smile. You are an idealist, Alessandra, he said. You still believe in hope. In redemption. And you don't? She challenged. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the candles on the table. I have seen too much, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Too much darkness. Too much violence. I have lost faith. It has to end with you, she said. He turned to look at her, and he seemed shocked that the words had come from her of all people. He gave a wry smile. It always ends with blood, Kara. She shook her head. Not this time. He looked at her, really looked at her, and what makes you say that? Because it just does. He was about to respond, but the air shifted. Something had changed. He stood. She knew someone was coming. But who? And would they change everything? Chapter 11. Betrayal's bitter sting. Love's gentle balm. The heavy oak door to the dining room swung open, revealing not a servant, nor one of Dario's usual guards, but a figure that made Alessandra's blood run cold. It was Ricardo Gallo, the son of the current Gallo Don, a man known for his ruthlessness and his burning hatred for the Benedetti family. He was tall and lean, with a cruel, handsome face and eyes that glittered with a cold, predatory light. He was flanked by two of his own men, their hands resting conspicuously on the weapons holstered at their sides. Dario stood frozen, his hand instinctively moving towards the empty space where his gun usually resided. He had been caught off guard, unprepared, vulnerable. Alessandra felt a surge of terror, her mind racing, trying to comprehend the impossible. How had they gotten in? How had they bypassed the security, the guards, the elaborate network of protection that surrounded the villa? Ricardo, Dario said, his voice dangerously low, his eyes narrowed. What is the meaning of this? Ricardo smiled, a slow, chilling smile that didn't reach his eyes. I believe you know, Dario, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. We have some unfinished business. You are trespassing, Dario said, his voice tight with controlled fury. Leave now, and I will overlook this transgression. Ricardo laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Overlook? You think you are in a position to overlook anything, Benedetti? You are weak. Your empire is crumbling. And I am here to finish what my father started. Alessandra saw the truth in his words. Dario was weakened, distracted, his defenses down. He had been too focused on her, on the fragile connection they had been building, to see the danger that was closing in. How did you get in? Dario asked, his gaze sweeping over Ricardo's men, searching for a clue, a sign of betrayal. Ricardo's smile widened. Let's just say I have friends in high places, he said, his voice smug. Friends who are tired of your rule. Friends who are willing to help me restore the balance of power. Alessandra's mind raced. Betrayal. It had to be. Someone within Dario's inner circle, someone he trusted, had betrayed him. But who? Her gaze fell on Marco, Dario's most trusted lieutenant, the man who had been with him for years, the man who had seemed so loyal, so devoted. Marco was not among his usual detail that evening. A chilling thought struck her. Could it be him? Before she could voice her suspicion, Ricardo made his move. He nodded to his men, and they drew their weapons, leveling them at Dario. It's over, Benedetti, Ricardo said, his voice cold and hard. You are finished. Alessandra reacted instinctively. She stepped in front of Dario, shielding him with her body, her arms outstretched. No, she cried. Don't do this. Ricardo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and amusement. Alessandra, he said, his voice mockingly gentle. The capo's plaything. How touching. You are willing to die for him? He is not what you think, Alessandra said, her voice trembling but firm. He is a good man. He wants peace. Ricardo laughed again. Peace? There is no peace in our world, Alessandra. Only power. And power belongs to the strong. He raised his hand, signaling his men to fire. Alessandra closed her eyes, bracing herself for the impact, for the pain, for the end. But the shots never came. Instead, she heard a shout, a scuffle, the sound of bodies colliding. She opened her eyes, her vision blurred with tears. Dario had pushed her aside, throwing himself in front of the bullets. He grappled with one of Ricardo's men, disarming him, while the other man lay on the floor, unconscious. But Ricardo still had his weapon, and he was aiming it at Dario's back. Alessandra screamed, "Dario, look out!" Dario spun around, just as Ricardo fired. The bullet grazed his arm, drawing a line of blood, but he didn't flinch. He lunged at Ricardo, tackling him to the ground, his hands closing around his throat. The two men struggled, their bodies locked in a desperate embrace. Alessandra watched, frozen with terror, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, the door to the dining room burst open again, and a group of Dario's men rushed in, their weapons drawn. They had been alerted by the commotion, by Alessandra's screams. They quickly subdued Ricardo and his remaining man, disarming them and dragging them away. Dario stood up, his chest heaving, his face pale and drawn. He looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else. Something that looked like love. He reached out to her, his hand trembling slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Alessandra nodded, tears streaming down her face. She rushed into his arms, burying her head in his chest, holding him tight. I thought I was going to lose you," she sobbed. He held her close, his arms strong and protective. "You won't lose me, Alessandra," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I promise you." He stroked her hair, his touch gentle and soothing. He kissed the top of her head, his lips lingering on her skin. "I was right about Marco," she said quietly, once the shaking stopped. Dario pulled back, to look into her eyes.
Marco?
He asked, puzzled. He wasn't there. He was the only one. It had to be him. Dario nodded slowly, his face grim. "You are right. He had Marco followed as soon as he knew something was happening." He held her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You saved my life, Alessandra," he said, his voice filled with emotion. You risked everything for me." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a love she could no longer deny. "I would do it again," she said, her voice sincere. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers. It was a soft, gentle kiss, a kiss that spoke of gratitude, of relief, of a love that had blossomed in the midst of danger, a love that had been forged in the crucible of betrayal and violence. This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation. The feeling had solidified. It had bloomed. And they knew, no matter what, that they would always have each other. They just hoped it would be enough. Chapter 12. The Price of Defiance, the Cost of Surrender. The aftermath of Ricardo's attempted coup was swift and brutal. Dario, his authority challenged, his life threatened, responded with a force that sent shockwaves through the underworld. Marco, his betrayal confirmed, was dealt with swiftly and silently. His body was never found, a grim warning to anyone else who might consider defying the capo. The gallows, their plot exposed, their power diminished, were forced to retreat, licking their wounds and biding their time. Dario had won this battle, but the war was far from over. He knew that the gallows would be back, that they would continue to seek their revenge. In the days that followed, Dario withdrew into himself, his demeanor colder, his focus sharper. He spent hours locked in his study, meeting with his lieutenants, planning his next moves, strengthening his defenses. He was like a wounded animal, lashing out at anyone who came too close. Alessandra felt the distance growing between them, the fragile connection they had built threatened by the ever-present dangers of their world. She understood his need for control, his need to project strength, but she also missed the glimpses of vulnerability, the moments of tenderness that had flickered between them. She tried to reach him, to bridge the gap that had opened up, but he seemed determined to keep her at arm's length. He treated her with a chilling courtesy, a formal politeness that only served to emphasize the vast gulf between them. One evening, she found him standing on the balcony, gazing out at the city lights. He was smoking a cigar, the fragrant smoke curling around his head, obscuring his face. "Dario," she said, her voice soft. He turned, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Alessandra," he said, his voice flat.
Can we talk?
She asked, her voice hesitant. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He gestured to a pair of chairs on the balcony.
Seat.
She sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He remained standing, his back to her, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "You have been distant," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "Since that night." He didn't respond, his silence a heavy weight in the air. "I understand that you are worried," she continued, "that you are under pressure. But I am here for you. I want to help." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and frustration. "Help?" he echoed, his voice laced with sarcasm. "How can you possibly help me, Alessandra? You are an outsider. You do not belong in this world." His words stung, a sharp reminder of her precarious position, of the vast gulf that separated them. "I may not belong in your world, Dario," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I care about you. I want you to be safe." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, a hint of weariness in his voice. "I know you do, Alessandra," he said, his voice softer. "But caring is a weakness. In this world, it can get you killed." "It is not a weakness, Dario," she said, her voice firm. "It is a strength. It is what makes us human." He shook his head, a faint, sad smile playing on his lips. "You are an idealist, Alessandra," he said. "You still believe in good, in love. And you don't?" she challenged. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the flickering city lights. "I have seen too much," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Too much darkness. Too much betrayal. I have learned to protect myself, to shut off my emotions." "But you can't shut them off completely, Dario," she said, her voice pleading. "You are not a machine. You are a man. You have a heart. You have feelings." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "And what good are feelings, Alessandra?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. "In a world like this? They only bring pain. They only make you vulnerable." "They also bring joy," she said, her voice soft. "They bring connection. They bring love." He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. It was a gentle touch, almost tender, and it sent a shiver through her. "Love," he echoed, his voice a husky whisper. "A dangerous word, Alessandra. A dangerous emotion." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. She could smell the scent of his cologne, mixed with the aroma of the cigar smoke. She felt a pull towards him, a magnetic force that was both terrifying and irresistible. "It is worth fighting for," she said, her voice shaking slightly. He kissed her then, a desperate, passionate kiss that spoke of longing, of fear, of a love that was both forbidden and undeniable. It was a kiss that acknowledged the dangers they faced, the obstacles they had to overcome, but it was also a kiss that promised hope, that whispered of a future where they could be together, free from the shadows that surrounded them. But even as they kissed, Alessandra knew that the price of defiance, the cost of surrender, could be steep. Their love was a fragile flame, flickering in the darkness, threatened by the winds of violence and betrayal. She didn't know if their love would be enough to survive. But she was willing to fight for it, to risk everything for the chance of a future where they could be together, free from the darkness that had haunted them for so long. The stakes were high, but the potential reward, a love that transcended the boundaries of their world, was worth the risk. Chapter 13. Ghosts in the Palazzo's halls. The tentative peace that had settled over the villa after Riccardo's failed attack was shattered by a series of unsettling events. Small things at first, easily dismissed as coincidences, but gradually escalating, creating an atmosphere of unease and suspicion. Objects disappeared from Alessandra's room, only to reappear in unexpected places. Whispers followed her as she walked through the halls, servants averting their gazes, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and pity. She heard footsteps outside her door at night, but when she opened it, no one was there. The most disturbing incident occurred one evening when she found a single white rose, its petals stained with what looked suspiciously like blood, lying on her pillow. It was a clear message, a threat, but from whom?
And why?
She confided in Dario, her voice trembling as she recounted the strange occurrences. He listened, his face grim, his eyes narrowed. "It is the gallows," he said, his voice flat. "They are trying to unsettle us. To intimidate you. But how are they getting in?" Alessandra asked. "The security is tight. You said so yourself." He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "There may be another leak," he said, his voice low. "Someone else working with them." From within, Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. The thought of another betrayal, another hidden enemy within the walls of the villa, was terrifying. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head. "I do not know," he said. "But I will find them. I will expose them. And they will pay." He launched a thorough investigation, questioning his men, scrutinizing their movements, searching for any sign of treachery. The atmosphere in the villa became even more tense, more oppressive. Everyone was under suspicion. Everyone was watched. Alessandra, meanwhile, felt increasingly isolated, increasingly vulnerable. She felt like she was being watched, followed, her every move scrutinized. She started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams of being chased, hunted, captured. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, her body trembling. One night, she woke up to the sound of music, a faint, melancholic melody drifting through the silent halls. It sounded like it was coming from the old music room, the one with the dusty piano. Curiosity and a growing sense of unease propelled her from her bed. She crept through the dark corridors, her bare feet silent on the marble floors, the faint moonlight filtering through the tall windows casting eerie shadows on the walls. As she approached the music room, the melody grew louder, clearer. It was a familiar tune, a hauntingly beautiful piece that she had heard somewhere before, but couldn't quite place. She pushed open the door to the music room, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dimly lit by a single candle, casting flickering shadows on the walls, on the dusty piano, on the figure seated at the keys. It was a woman, her back to Alessandra, her long, dark hair cascading down her shoulders. She was wearing a white dress, a dress that looked strangely familiar. Alessandra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She recognized the woman, the dress, the music. It was Dario's mother, or rather, her ghost. The woman continued to play, her fingers moving gracefully over the yellowed keys, the melody filling the room with a profound sadness, a longing that echoed Alessandra's own. Alessandra wanted to run, to scream, to escape this terrifying vision, but she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, mesmerized by the ghostly figure, by the haunting music. The woman finished playing, her hands falling to her lap. She slowly turned, her face pale and ethereal, her eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful gaze. Alessandra recognized the face, the eyes. It was the same woman from the photograph in the locked room, the same woman from Dario's locket. "Alessandra," the woman said, her voice a soft, whispering echo. Alessandra's heart leaped into her throat. The ghost knew her name. Who are you?" Alessandra stammered, her voice trembling. "I am Alara," the woman said. "Dario's mother." Alessandra felt a wave of dizziness, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. She gripped the doorframe for support. You are a ghost," Alessandra said, stating the obvious. Alara nodded, a faint, sad smile playing on her lips. "I am trapped here," she said. "Bound to this place.
By sorrow.
By regret." Why are you showing yourself to me?" Alessandra asked. Alara's gaze intensified, her eyes searching Alessandra's. "You can help him," she said. "You can save him." "Save him?" Alessandra echoed, her voice confused. "Save him from what?" "From the darkness," Alara said. "From the curse. From the gallows." She stood and floated. She did not walk. Closer to Alessandra. Only love can break it. Only your love. Alessandra felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of fear, confusion, and a strange, unexpected hope. I do love him, Alessandra said, her voice trembling. Alara smiled, a radiant, beautiful smile that lit up her face. Then you must fight for him, she said. You must break the cycle. You must end the feud. She reached out and touched Alessandra's cheek, her touch cold, ethereal, but strangely comforting. He needs you. The real you, not the idea of what you are. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished, fading into the shadows, leaving Alessandra alone in the silent, dimly lit room, the echoes of the music still lingering in the air. The encounter left Alessandra shaken, but also strangely empowered. She had seen a ghost, spoken to Dario's mother, been given a mission, a purpose. She had to save Dario, to break the curse, to end the feud. It was a daunting task, a seemingly impossible one. But she was determined to try, to fight for the man she loved, for the future they both deserved. The question was how? And could she trust what she had seen? Doubt, as always, remained. Chapter 14. A tapestry woven with lies and longing. Alessandra's encounter with Alara's ghost fueled a renewed determination within her. She knew she had to find a way to end the feud with the gallows, to break the cycle of violence that had haunted the Benedetti family for generations. But how? She was an outsider, a woman with no power, no influence in this brutal, male-dominated world. She started by researching the history of the feud, delving deeper into the past, seeking clues, seeking answers. She spent hours in the dusty library, poring over old documents, family records, newspaper clippings. She discovered that the feud had begun not with Dario's grandfather, as he had been led to believe, but with his great-grandfather, a man named Lorenzo Benedetti. Lorenzo, it turned out, had been a ruthless, ambitious man who had built his empire on a foundation of lies and deceit. He had cheated the Gallos out of their rightful inheritance, a vast tract of land that was now the heart of the Benedetti territory. He had also orchestrated the murder of the then Gallo Don, framing a rival family for the crime, igniting a bloody war that had claimed countless lives. The truth was a revelation, a shattering of the carefully constructed narrative that Dario had grown up with. His grandfather, the respected man, had been a victim of his own father's sins, a pawn in a game of revenge that he had not started. Alessandra knew she had to tell Dario, to share this devastating truth with him. But she also knew that it would be a blow to his pride, to his sense of identity, to everything he had ever believed in. She waited for the right moment, a moment when he was not consumed by the pressures of his position, by the constant threat of violence. She found him one evening in the gardens, tending to his mother's roses. He looked tired, his face etched with worry, but there was also a gentleness in his touch, a vulnerability that he rarely allowed himself to show. Dario, she said, her voice soft. We need to talk. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of apprehension in his gaze, a sense that he knew what was coming. What is it, Alessandra? He asked, his voice wary. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for his reaction. I have been researching, she said. The feud, the history, the truth. His expression hardened, his body tensing. The truth? He echoed, his voice laced with suspicion. What truth? She told him everything, recounting the story of Lorenzo Benedetti, his deceit, his betrayal, his crimes. She showed him the documents she had found, the evidence that confirmed the gallows claims, that shattered the myth of his grandfather's innocence. He listened in silence, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Anger, disbelief, betrayal, and finally, a profound sadness. When she was finished, he turned away from her, his gaze fixed on the roses, his hands clenched into fists. It is a lie, he said, his voice trembling slightly. It cannot be true. It is, Dario, Alessandra said, her voice gentle but firm. I have seen the proof. He remained silent for a long moment, his shoulders shaking slightly. Alessandra felt a pang of sympathy for him, for the pain he was enduring, for the shattering of his illusions. Finally, he turned back to her, his eyes filled with a raw, unbearable grief. "My father," he said, his voice hoarse. He didn't know. He spent his life seeking revenge for a lie. He did what he thought was right, Dario, Alessandra said, her voice soothing. He was a victim. Just like you. He looked at her, his gaze searching hers. "And now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" Alessandra took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We end it," she said, her voice firm. "We break the cycle. We make peace." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. "Peace?" he echoed, his voice skeptical. "With the gallows?" "It is impossible." "It is not impossible, Dario," she said. "It is difficult. But it is necessary. For you. For me. For the future." "And how do we do that, Alessandra?" he asked after all this time. "After all the blood?" "I think your mother showed me," she said. "There is only one way." He looked at her, really looked at her. "You saw her, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. She nodded. He knew. Of course he did. She had found her. She had to find a way to tell him what his mother had said. But would he listen? She hoped he would, but she knew that his world worked on its own terms. Blood for blood. Chapter 15. The cracks in the Don's armor. Dario's acceptance of Alessandra's encounter with his mother's ghost was a turning point. It was as if the veil between their worlds, the tangible and the spiritual, had thinned, allowing for a deeper, more profound connection. He didn't question her sanity, didn't dismiss her experience as a hallucination or a dream. He knew, somehow, that she had spoken to Alara, that she had received a message, a guidance from beyond the grave. "What did she say?" he asked, his voice low and intense, his eyes searching hers. Alessandra hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She knew that Alara's message, "Only love can break it. Only your love," was open to interpretation. It could refer to Dario's love for her, or it could refer to a more general love, a compassion, a willingness to forgive, to break the cycle of hatred and violence. She said that the feud must end, Alessandra said. That only love can break the curse. Dario nodded, his expression grim. "But what kind of love, Alessandra?" he asked. "The love between a man and a woman? Or the love that transcends blood? That transcends vengeance?" Alessandra didn't have a definitive answer. She suspected that it was both, that both kinds of love were necessary to heal the wounds of the past, to forge a new future. "I think both," she said, her voice hesitant. "But I also think she meant your love. Your willingness to forgive. To let go of the past." Dario looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Forgiveness," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "It is a difficult thing, Alessandra. Especially in our world. But it is not impossible, Dario," she said. "You are not your father. You are not your grandfather. You can choose a different path." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a conflict that mirrored her own. "And what if I fail?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What if I am not strong enough?" Alessandra took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "You are strong enough, Dario," she said, her voice firm. "You are the strongest man I know. And you are not alone. I am here. I will help you." He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. "You believe in me, Alessandra?" he asked, his voice a husky whisper. "I do," she said, her voice sincere. "With all my heart." He kissed her then, a soft, gentle kiss that spoke of gratitude, of hope, of a love that was growing stronger with each passing day. It was a kiss that acknowledged the challenges they faced, the obstacles they had to overcome, but it was also a kiss that promised a future where they could be together, free from the shadows of the past. But even as they kissed, Alessandra knew that the path to peace would be fraught with danger, with resistance, with betrayal. Dario's decision to end the feud would not be welcomed by everyone in his world. There were those who thrived on violence, who profited from the conflict, who would do anything to maintain the status quo. And then there were the gallows. Would they be willing to accept peace? Would they be willing to forgive, to forget the past? Or would they see Dario's offer as a sign of weakness, an opportunity to strike a final, devastating blow? Alessandra knew that she and Dario were walking a tightrope, balancing between hope and despair, between love and hate, between life and death. But she was determined to walk that tightrope with him, to support him, to guide him, to help him find the strength to break the cycle of violence, to forge a new path, a path of peace, a path of love. As they made their way back to the villa, hand in hand, Dario stopped, pulling her close. If this doesn't work, you need to go. You must run away. This life, it's no place for you. She shook her head and put a finger to his lips. I am not going anywhere. He smiled. You are, as I have said before, full of surprises. As are you. He bent to kiss her, but before his lips met hers, a shot rang out, shattering the quiet. Dario grunted, his body going stiff. Alessandra screamed. The cracks in the Don's armor were beginning to show, and his enemies were clearly taking advantage. Who had fired the shot? And would Dario survive? Chapter 16. Reclaiming the Stolen Dawn. Alessandra reacted instinctively, pulling Dario down with her to the ground, shielding his body with her own. The shot had come from somewhere in the gardens, from the direction of the old rose bushes, his mother's roses. She scanned the area, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes searching for any sign of movement, any hint of the shooter. But the gardens were silent, still, bathed in the soft glow of the twilight. The only sound was Dario's ragged breathing, the only movement the trembling of his body. She carefully examined him, her hands moving over his chest, his back, searching for the wound. She found it on his shoulder, a clean entry and exit wound, the bullet having passed through the fleshy part of his upper arm. It was not a life-threatening injury, but it was bleeding profusely. Dario, she said, her voice trembling. You're shot. We need to get you inside. He nodded, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and anger. Help me up, he said, his voice hoarse. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they stumbled towards the villa. She kept glancing back, expecting another shot, expecting the shooter to emerge from the shadows. But nothing happened. They reached the villa, the heavy oak doors closing behind them with a resounding thud, sealing them inside, offering a temporary refuge from the dangers outside. Alessandra helped Dario to a nearby chair, her hands shaking as she retrieved the first aid kit, the same one she had used before, after Ricardo's attack. She cleaned and bandaged his wound, her touch gentle but firm, her movements efficient and practiced. As she worked, she noticed the look on his face, the cold, hard mask that had descended over his features. The vulnerability, the tenderness that had been there just moments before, was gone, replaced by the ruthless determination of the capo. Who do you think it was? She asked, her voice breaking the silence. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. The gallows, he said, his voice flat. Who else? But how did they get in? Alessandra asked. The security, he shook his head. There is another traitor, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. Someone else working with them. From within. Alessandra felt a surge of despair. It seemed that every time they took a step forward, they were pushed 2 steps back. The enemies were everywhere, both outside and inside the walls of the villa. We need to find them, Dario, she said, her voice firm. We need to expose them. Before it's too late. He nodded, his gaze fixed on some distant point. I will, he said, his voice cold and hard. I will find them.
And they will pay.
He stood up, his movements stiff but determined. He walked towards the door, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. Where are you going? Alessandra asked, her voice filled with apprehension. To do what needs to be done, he said, his voice flat. Dario, no, she pleaded. You're injured.
You need to rest.
He turned to her, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. I cannot rest, Alessandra, he said. Not now. Not ever. I am the capo. I must protect what is mine. He left the room, the door closing behind him with a finality that sent a chill down Alessandra's spine. She knew he was going to hunt down the shooter, to seek revenge, to continue the cycle of violence. She wanted to stop him, to plead with him to choose a different path, but she knew it was useless. He was the capo, and he would do what he thought was necessary, what he had been trained to do, what his world demanded of him. She sank into the chair, her body trembling, her mind racing. She felt utterly helpless, utterly alone. She had failed. She had failed to save him, to break the curse, to end the feud. But then, she remembered Alara's words, "Only love can break it. Only your love." And she realized that she had not failed, not yet. She still had her love, her determination, her belief in him. She stood up, her legs shaky but firm. She would not give up. She would not surrender. She would continue to fight for him, to fight for their future, to fight for the love that had blossomed in the midst of darkness. She went to the window, gazing out at the night. The city lights twinkled below, a vast, sprawling panorama of human life. She knew that somewhere out there, Dario was hunting his enemies, seeking his revenge. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer, a plea to whatever gods might be listening. She prayed for his safety, for his strength, for his redemption. She didn't know what the future held, what dangers awaited them, but she knew one thing for sure: she would not abandon him. She would stand by his side no matter what. She would be his light, his guide, his strength. She would be his love. And as she stood there, watching the dawn break over the city, she felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief that even in the darkest of nights, love could prevail. She just hoped it would be enough. She had to reclaim the stolen dawn, for both of them. And she knew, somehow, that she would. Chapter 17. Flames of Rebellion. Ashes of Regret. Alessandra didn't wait for Dario's return. She knew that his pursuit of vengeance would only lead to more bloodshed, more pain, more suffering. She had to find another way, a way to break the cycle of violence, to end the feud once and for all. She decided to take a drastic step, a step that could potentially put her life in danger, but one that she felt was necessary. She decided to contact the gallows, to reach out to them, to offer them a chance for peace. She knew it was a risky move, a gamble that could easily backfire. The gallows were her enemies, Dario's enemies, a family consumed by hatred and a thirst for revenge. They could easily kill her, torture her, use her as a bargaining chip against Dario. But she had to try. She had to believe that there was still some humanity left in them, some willingness to listen, to reason, to consider a different path. She used a burner phone, one she had found hidden in a drawer in her room, a relic from Dario's past, a tool he used for clandestine communications. She called a number she had found in the old documents she had been researching, a number that belonged to a known associate of the Gallo family, a man named Salvatore. The phone rang several times, the sound echoing in the silent room. Alessandra's heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling. Finally, a gruff voice answered. "Who is this?" "My name is Alessandra Romano," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. I need to speak to Don Gallo. It is urgent." There was a moment of silence, then a harsh laugh.
Romano?
"You have nerve calling here. What do you want?" "I want peace," Alessandra said, her voice firm. "I want to end this feud. I have a proposal." There was another silence, longer this time. Alessandra could hear the man's breathing, the sound of his thoughts churning. "A proposal?" he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "What kind of proposal?" I cannot discuss it over the phone," Alessandra said. "I need to meet with Don Gallo. In person. Alone." The man laughed again, a mocking sound. "You think he will meet with you? You are nothing. A pawn. A plaything." "I am more than that," Alessandra said, her voice rising. "And I have information. Information that could change everything." She didn't elaborate, knowing that she had to pique his interest, to make him believe that she was worth listening to. There was another silence. Then the man sighed. "Very well," he said. "I will relay your message. But I make no promises. Don Gallo is a busy man, and he is not known for his patience. Tell him it is about Lorenzo Benedetti," Alessandra said, using the name that she knew would get his attention. "Tell him I know the truth." The man didn't respond, but Alessandra heard a sharp intake of breath, a sign that she had hit her mark. "I will wait for your call," she said, then hung up the phone, her hands shaking. She had taken the first step, a dangerous, potentially fatal step. She had thrown herself into the lion's den, offering herself as bait, as a sacrifice. She didn't know if the gallows would accept her offer, if they would even agree to meet with her. But she had to hope. She had to believe that there was still a chance for peace, a chance for a future free from violence, free from hatred. She waited, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. The villa was silent, empty, Dario still gone, his men searching for the shooter, for the traitor. She felt utterly alone, isolated, vulnerable. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, the burner phone rang. Alessandra jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. She picked up the phone, her hand trembling. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don Gallo will meet with you," the gruff voice said.
Tomorrow.
"At dawn. At the old church. San Lorenzo. You know it?" Alessandra knew the church. It was an abandoned ruin, a relic of the past, a place steeped in history and blood. It was a fitting location for this meeting, a place where the ghosts of the past could witness the potential for a new future. "I know it," she said, her voice firm. "I will be there." She hung up the phone, her mind racing. She had done it. She had secured a meeting with Don Gallo, the head of the rival family, the man who held the key to ending the feud. But she also knew that this meeting could be a trap, a ruse, a way to lure her into the open, to kill her, to punish her for her defiance.
She didn't care.
She was willing to risk everything, to sacrifice everything, for the chance of peace, for the chance of a future with Dario, a future free from the shadows of the past. As she prepared for the meeting, she wrote a letter to Dario, explaining everything, telling him about her research, about Alera's message, about her meeting with Don Gallo. She sealed the letter, placing it on his desk, where he would find it if she didn't return. She knew that he would be furious, that he would try to stop her, that he would never forgive her if she failed. But she had to do this for him, for herself, for the future they both deserved. As she left the villa, under the cover of darkness, she felt a sense of both fear and determination. She was walking into the unknown, facing her enemies alone, armed only with her love, her courage, and her belief in the possibility of peace. She didn't know if she would succeed, if she would survive.
But she knew that she had to try.
The flames of rebellion burned brightly within her, fueled by the ashes of regret, by the hope for a new dawn. And she would not be deterred. Chapter 18. The Heart's Uncharted Territory. The old church of San Lorenzo stood silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, a crumbling monument to a forgotten faith. Its stone walls were weathered and cracked, its stained glass windows shattered, its once grand entrance, now a gaping maw of darkness. The air around it was heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and the ghosts of centuries past. Alessandra arrived just as the first faint streaks of light began to paint the eastern horizon. She was alone, as agreed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was dressed simply, in dark clothes that blended with the shadows, her only weapon a small, silver crucifix that had belonged to her mother, clutched tightly in her hand. She walked towards the church entrance, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She could feel the eyes of unseen watchers, the weight of anticipation, the palpable sense of danger. As she stepped inside the church, the darkness enveloped her, swallowing her whole. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of incense and dust. The only light came from the faint rays of dawn filtering through the broken windows, casting eerie shadows on the crumbling walls, on the rows of empty pews, on the altar that stood at the far end of the nave. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing man with a stern, weathered face and eyes that glittered with a cold, calculating intelligence. It was Don Carlo Gallo, the head of the Gallo family, the man who held the key to ending the feud. He was flanked by two of his men, their faces grim, their hands resting on the weapons holstered at their sides. Alessandra felt a surge of fear, but she stood her ground, her chin lifted in defiance. Alessandra Romano, Don Gallo said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. You have courage coming here. Alone. I came to talk, Don Gallo, Alessandra said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. To offer you a chance for peace. He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the silent church. Peace?
He said.
You speak of peace? After all that has happened? After all the blood that has been spilled? Blood begets blood, Don Gallo, Alessandra said, her voice firm. It is a cycle that must be broken. And I believe it can be broken.
By us.
He looked at her, his eyes narrowed, his gaze intense. And why should I believe you? He asked. You are a Romano, the daughter of my enemy. I am not my father, Don Gallo, Alessandra said. And Dario, he is not his grandfather. Or his great-grandfather.
He wants peace.
Just like I do. She told him everything, recounting the story of Lorenzo Benedetti, the deceit, the betrayal, the crimes that had started the feud. She showed him the copies of the documents she had found, the evidence that confirmed his family's claims, that shattered the myth of Benedetti innocence. He listened in silence, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Anger, disbelief, a flicker of something else. Could it be hope? When she was finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the documents, his mind clearly wrestling with the implications of this new information. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and something akin to respect. And what is it you propose, Alessandra Romano? He asked, his voice softer now, less hostile. Alessandra took a deep breath, steeling herself for his reaction. I propose a marriage, she said, her voice clear and strong. Between me and you. The silence that followed was deafening. Don Gallo stared at her, his expression unreadable. His men shifted uneasily, their hands tightening on their weapons. Alessandra felt her heart sink. She had expected resistance, anger, even violence. But not the silence. She had miscalculated. She had failed. Then, Don Gallo began to laugh, a deep, rumbling laugh that echoed through the church. It was not a mocking laugh, not a cruel laugh, but a laugh of surprise. Of amusement? A marriage? He said, his voice laced with incredulity. You propose a marriage?
To me?
It is the only way, Don Gallo, Alessandra said, her voice firm. A union between our families. A way to bind the wounds. To forge a new future. You are a bold woman, Alessandra Romano, he said, his gaze admiring. And a foolish one. Do you think such a union would erase the past? Do you think it would end the hatred? It would be a start, Don Gallo, Alessandra said, her voice pleading. A symbol. A promise. A way to move forward. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of her words, the depth of her commitment. Then he slowly nodded. Perhaps, he said, his voice thoughtful. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps it is time for a change. He paused, his gaze shifting to the altar, to the crumbling remains of a once sacred space. But it is not a decision I can make alone, he said. I must consult with my family, with my advisors. I understand, Alessandra said, her voice relieved. But please, consider it. Consider the possibility. The future. He nodded again. I will, he said. I will consider it. And I will give you my answer.
Soon.
He turned to leave, his men following close behind. He paused at the entrance of the church, turning back to Alessandra. You are a remarkable woman, Alessandra Romano, he said, his voice filled with a grudging respect. And perhaps a dangerous one. For both our families. He left, disappearing into the dawn, leaving Alessandra alone in the silent, empty church. She stood there, her body trembling, her mind reeling. She had done it. She had faced her enemy, offered him a chance for peace, and he had listened. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. The hardest part was yet to come. Convincing Don Gallo was one thing. Convincing Dario, convincing their families, convincing the world that this unlikely union could actually work was another. She left the church, stepping out into the morning light, feeling a mixture of hope and trepidation. She had planted a seed of peace. But she didn't know if it would grow, if it would blossom, or if it would be crushed under the weight of hatred and violence. She looked at the city slowly awakening around her. She had ventured into uncharted territory and was not sure of what the future held. She had a long road ahead of her. She only hoped that it would lead her to a brighter, more peaceful future. She had done this for Dario, for their families, for their love. But would it be enough? Chapter 19. Blood and Roses, a Twisted Union. Alessandra returned to the villa to find it in chaos. Dario was gone, having left with his men to hunt down the gallows, believing them responsible for the shooting. She found his lieutenant, a man named Giovanni, who had been left in charge, and explained everything, her voice urgent, desperate. Giovanni listened, his face a mask of disbelief and growing alarm. "You did what?" he exclaimed, his voice incredulous. "You met with Don Gallo? Alone? Are you insane?" "I had to do something, Giovanni," Alessandra said, her voice pleading. "Dario is on a path of destruction. He will destroy himself. And everyone around him." Giovanni shook his head, his expression grim. "He will never agree to this, Alessandra," he said. "A marriage? To Don Gallo? It is unthinkable." "It is the only way, Giovanni," Alessandra insisted. "The only way to end this feud. To break the cycle of violence." She showed him the letter she had written to Dario, explaining her actions, her reasoning, her hope for a peaceful future. She begged him to deliver the letter, to convince Dario to listen, to consider her proposal. Giovanni hesitated, his loyalty to Dario warring with his understanding of Alessandra's desperate plea. He knew that Dario was a proud, stubborn man, a man who would never willingly accept such a union, such a compromise. But he also knew that Alessandra was right, that the feud was consuming them all, that it had to end, somehow. "I will try," he said, his voice reluctant. "I will deliver your letter. But I make no promises. Dario, he is not an easy man to persuade." Alessandra thanked him, her heart filled with a fragile hope. She knew that she had done everything she could, that she had put her life on the line for the chance of peace. Now it was up to Dario, up to his willingness to listen, to understand, to forgive. She waited, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. The villa was silent, empty, the servants going about their duties with hushed voices and averted gazes. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, a pawn in a deadly game. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, she heard the sound of cars approaching, the roar of engines, the screech of tires. Dario had returned. She went to the window, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes searching for him. She saw him emerge from the lead car, his face grim, his clothes stained with blood. He had clearly been in a fight, a violent confrontation. She rushed to the door, opening it just as he reached the top of the stairs. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable, his expression a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else. Something that looked like betrayal. "Alessandra," he said, his voice cold and hard. "What have you done?" She knew that Giovanni had delivered the letter, that Dario had read her words, that he knew about her meeting with Don Gallo. "I did what I had to do, Dario," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "To save you. To save us." He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them, overwhelming her senses. She could smell the scent of blood, of gunpowder, of violence. "Save us?" he echoed, his voice laced with sarcasm. "By marrying our enemy? By surrendering to the gallows?" "It is not surrender, Dario," she said, her voice pleading. "It is a compromise, a chance for peace." "There is no peace with the gallows, Alessandra," he said, his voice rising. "Only victory. Or death." He grabbed her arm, his grip tight, painful. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You went behind my back. You defied me." "I did it for you, Dario," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. For us. For our future. He shook his head, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. There is no future, Alessandra, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Not like this. Not with them. He released her arm, turning away from her, his shoulders slumping in defeat. It is over, he said. You have destroyed everything. Alessandra felt her heart break. She had failed. She had risked everything, and she had failed. She had lost him. She had lost their love. She had lost the chance for a future together. She watched as he walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the villa. She was left alone, standing in the doorway, her tears streaming down her face, her body trembling with despair. But even in her despair, she knew that she had done the right thing, that she had tried her best, that she had fought for what she believed in. And she knew that she would never regret it, even if it meant losing everything. She had planted the seed of peace, and even though it seemed to have withered and died, she still held on to a flicker of hope, a belief that somehow, someday, it might still blossom, that love might still prevail over hatred, that light might still conquer darkness. But for now, all she felt was the crushing weight of loss, the bitter taste of defeat, the agonizing pain of a love that had been shattered by the harsh realities of their world. She had offered herself as a sacrifice, a bridge between two warring families. And it had been rejected. She looked at the roses in the garden, and for the first time, could not stand their sight. They were no longer a symbol of love. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Dario's rejection was a devastating blow, but Alessandra refused to give up. She knew that she had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, a seed of hope in his heart. She had to believe that it would eventually take root, that he would eventually come to see the wisdom of her actions, the necessity of peace. She spent the next few days in a state of limbo, avoiding Dario, avoiding everyone. She wandered through the villa like a ghost, haunted by the memories of their shared moments, by the echoes of their laughter, by the lingering scent of his cologne. She knew that she couldn't stay there, not anymore. She had become a pariah, an outcast, a symbol of betrayal in the eyes of Dario's men, in the eyes of the entire mafia world. She decided to leave, to return to her family's palazzo, to the life she had known before, even though that life no longer held any meaning for her. She packed a small bag, gathering a few personal belongings, a few mementos of her time with Dario. As she was preparing to leave, she heard a knock on her door. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew who it was. She opened the door, and there he stood, Dario, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, regret, and something else. Something that looked like longing. Alessandra, he said, his voice hoarse. Where do you think you're going? I am leaving, Dario, she said, her voice trembling. I cannot stay here. Not anymore. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. You cannot leave, he said, his voice firm. You are mine. You belong to me. I belong to no one, Dario, she said, her voice rising. I am my own person, and I choose to leave. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight, but not painful. You made a promise, he said, his voice low and intense. You offered yourself to the gallows, and you rejected it, Dario, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. You chose violence. You chose hatred.
You chose death.
He shook his head, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. I made a mistake, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I was wrong. Alessandra felt a surge of hope, a flicker of warmth in the cold darkness of her despair. Could it be? Could he have changed his mind? What are you saying, Dario? She asked, her voice hesitant. He released her arm, taking a step back. He looked at her, his gaze filled with a vulnerability she had rarely seen. I have been thinking, he said, his voice slow and deliberate. About what you said. About the feud. About the future. He paused, his jaw tightening. And I have realized that you were right. That there is no future. In violence. In hatred. Only in peace. Alessandra's heart leaped with joy, with relief. He had listened. He had understood.
He had changed.
Dario, she said, her voice filled with emotion. Does that mean? He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. It means I accept your proposal, he said, his voice firm. I will marry Don Gallo. If he still agrees. Alessandra felt tears streaming down her face, tears of joy, tears of relief, tears of love. She rushed into his arms, burying her head in his chest, holding him tight. He will, she managed to say. Thank you, Alessandra, he said, his voice a low murmur. Thank you for saving me. For saving us. He held her close, his arms strong and protective. He kissed the top of her head, his lips lingering on her skin. I love you, Alessandra, he said, his voice filled with a sincerity she had never heard before. I have always loved you. From the moment I saw you. And I love you, Dario, she said, her voice sincere. With all my heart. They stood there, embracing, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. They had found their way back to each other. Through the darkness, through the violence, through the hatred. They had chosen love. They had chosen peace. They had chosen a future together. But even as they embraced, they knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be resistance, there would be challenges, there would be those who would try to destroy their union, to sabotage their efforts for peace. Dario received a call, confirming that Don Gallo had agreed. They decided to meet that very day. At the old church, of course. Alessandra and Dario arrived, hand in hand. Don Carlo was waiting for them. They stood before the altar, a strange, unlikely trio, bound together by a shared desire for peace, by a shared hope for a new future. Don Gallo looked at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and something akin to approval. So, he said, his voice gruff, you are serious about this? You are willing to unite our families? Dario nodded, his gaze firm, his hand tightening around Alessandra's. I am, he said. I am ready to end this feud. To forge a new alliance. To build a new future. Don Gallo smiled, a slow, chilling smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Very well, he said. Then let us begin. But just before they could agree the terms, a hail of gunfire erupted. Alessandra screamed. Dario pushed her behind him. This was it. The final confrontation. Who would survive? And as the shots continued to ring out, Alessandra was sure she could hear the faint sound of a ghost weeping. Epilogue. The gunfire ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The air, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood, slowly cleared, revealing a scene of carnage and devastation. Dario stood, miraculously unharmed, his body shielding Alessandra's, his gun still smoking in his hand. Don Gallo lay on the ground, his chest riddled with bullets, his eyes staring blankly at the shattered stained glass windows above. His men were dead, their bodies sprawled across the ancient stone floor, their weapons scattered around them. Alessandra, trembling but alive, emerged from behind Dario, her eyes wide with horror, her ears ringing from the deafening noise. She looked at the scene before her, at the bodies, at the blood, at the shattered remnants of their hopes for peace. Who? She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Who did this? Dario scanned the church, his eyes narrowed, his senses alert. He saw movement in the shadows, a figure emerging from behind a crumbling pillar. It was Giovanni, his lieutenant, his trusted friend, the man who had betrayed them. Giovanni held a gun in his hand, his face a mask of hatred and resentment. I did, he said, his voice cold and hard. I could not let this happen. This abomination. This union with our enemies. Dario stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and profound sorrow. Giovanni, he said, his voice low and pained.
Why?
Giovanni laughed, a harsh, mocking sound.
Why?
He echoed. Because you have gone soft, Dario. You have lost your way. You have forgotten who we are. We are Benedettis. We do not compromise. We do not forgive. We conquer. He raised his gun, aiming it at Dario. It is over, he said. I will restore the balance. I will reclaim our honor. Alessandra reacted instinctively. She stepped in front of Dario, shielding him with her body, just as she had done before.
No, Giovanni, she cried.
Don't do this. It's not too late. We can still have peace. Giovanni hesitated, his gaze flickering between Alessandra and Dario. He saw the love in their eyes, the determination, the unwavering bond that had survived so much. He lowered his gun, his hand trembling. He looked at Dario, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and despair. I cannot, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I am sorry. He turned the gun on himself, pulling the trigger. The shot echoed through the silent church, a final, tragic punctuation to the bloody saga of the feud. Alessandra screamed, collapsing to her knees, her body shaking uncontrollably. Dario knelt beside her, holding her close, his own tears mingling with hers. They had survived. The feud was over. But at what cost? The price of peace had been steep, paid in blood, in betrayal, in shattered dreams. They left the church, hand in hand, stepping out into the bright sunlight, leaving the darkness, the violence, the ghosts of the past behind them. They had a long road ahead of them, a road filled with challenges, with obstacles, with the need to rebuild, to heal, to forgive. But they were together. They had each other. And they had their love, a love that had been forged in the crucible of violence, a love that had survived the test of time, a love that would, they hoped, guide them towards a brighter, more peaceful future. They returned to the villa, a place forever marked by the events that happened, and began a new chapter. Alessandra planted a new rose bush in memory of Alara and as a sign of their newfound strength. Dario, by her side,
Watched on.
he knew they would never forget, but finally they could move forward. Together, the city sprawled before them, and although it was the same one they always knew, today it felt different. The future, although unknown, was finally theirs. The past was gone. It was time to move on.